Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this webinar, how to read and use EPDs. You will have heard the term EPD a lot today. It stands for Environmental Product Declaration, if you are new to this. But we do have quite an interesting mix of people attending today, representing NGOs, industry, government, a few LCA professionals and students as well. So welcome again. My name is Rob. I'm one of the presenters for today. And this webinar will be recorded, so you will receive the recording at the end of it if you're attending. And if you're an LCA certified professional, it's also good to know that this webinar can be used towards your CPD points. We will be presenting for around 40 minutes, and after that we will answer your questions. But please feel free to enter your questions as we go. We will get back to them at the end. So what we'll be talking about today, we have three speakers for you. First up is Steve Mitchell, who is the chair of the Australasian EPD Programme. I will follow up Steve, and we also have Jeff Vickers of thinkstep, and both of us are LCA consultants who have worked on the development and verification of quite a few EPDs. So hopefully we can give you some good insights today of what EPDs are, what they aren't, what sort of environmental impacts you can expect to see in an EPD. We also will go into some detail about how to read EPDs and especially what to look out for, because there's a number of aspects to an EPD that are quite important in order to make sense of them. We understand a lot of people are interested in comparing products using EPDs, so we will explain what some of the opportunities are and also what some of the pitfalls might be. So we will show you how to do that. And finally, we will show you how companies use EPDs, both internally and in their marketing, and how they're being used by third, for example, rating tools. We'll now hand over to Steve.
Thanks, Rob. Hello, everybody. Welcome. So as Rob explained, I'm the chair of the Australasian EPD Programme. If you just put the next slide on, Rob, please. Yeah, so for those who don't know us, we're a non-profit joint venture of the Australian and New Zealand Australian Life Cycle Assessment Professionals. So the two associations are joint venture partners in the organisation. We started about 3 years ago. We're an ISO 14025 compliant EPD program operator. And currently in Australia and New Zealand, we have 47 EPDs registered with the program, 42 in Australia and 5 in New Zealand. And we've got quite a few in the pipeline over the next 3 months to 12 months. A lot more EPDs will be coming. So we have an international presence through our regional partnership with the EPD International System. So that's a system of mutual recognition. So that, as the oldest EPD program in the world, that has registered over 1,000 EPDs in some 42 countries. Recently, EPDs were registered in China and South Korea, but there's a lot of EPDs. Most of these EPDs are registered in Europe.
Hi, Steve, are you still there? I think we might have just lost your audio. Apologies, everyone.
Confirming that I've also lost it.
Yeah, apologies for that. I will. While we'll wait for Steve to come back, I'll just continue with the slides. Currently, we've got about 30 members in the Australasian EPD program, and together they've published about 47 EPDs and counting. There's quite a few in the pipeline, so we expect to hit number 50 quite soon. And as you can see on the screen, there's quite a variety of companies that have already published EPDs. And you might also notice that the vast majority of these companies are active in the construction sector.
I'm back, Rob.
Thanks, Steve. Did you want to add anything?
Sorry about that. I don't know what happened there. So we've got 30 members at the moment from a variety of large, some well-known brands and some small and medium-sized enterprises as well. So covering a whole gamut of construction interior products as well as consumer products. Next slide, please, Rob. Yeah, so within each company can register a lot of EPDs. Some companies have multiple EPDs. For example, BlueScope have 4 EPDs for a variety of products, branded products as well as generic products. Australia Care have 2 EPDs, one of which includes multiple brands and multiple products within that brand. So each EPD can have a lot of data about a lot of different products, basically. The next slide. So what is an EPD? Well, basically it's an independently verified life cycle assessment-based environmental impact data. So it's the data which we'll talk about, Rob and Jeff will talk about more specifically, but you also include a lot of other environmental information there. That all gets verified by approved verifiers. So it couldn't represent part or all, the whole life cycle of a product. The minimum is cradle to gate, and it's not an EPD unless it's registered with an EPD program operator, such as Australasian EPD. The relevant standard here, as I mentioned before, is 14025, which makes it a Type 3 environmental declaration. Has to be third-party verified and based on LCA. Australasian EPD programs require all the construction product EPDs to be also compliant with EN 15804. Most of the construction products registered with the International EPD Program are also compliant with EN 15804, but some of the older ones aren't, so that's something you have to check on the International EPD database. There's a very helpful guide I'll just reference on the left side there, how ISO standards help in environmental labels and declarations. I encourage you to give that a bit of a look over if you've got the time. But EPDs essentially provide the data information to help people make purchasing decisions that have quantifiably lower impacts, and I emphasise the word quantifiable there. It's more than a tick, it's the actual quantifiable data that helps you feed that information into making better purchasing decisions and better projects that have lower environmental impact. Next slide, please, Rob. So the indicators we're talking about, for an EN 15804 compliant EPD, which all our construction products are on the program, they cover these environmental indicators, multiple indicators, global warming potential, ozone, phytochemical ozone, for example, down to abiotic depletion potential. So they're basically the carbon footprint of the product and its contributions to air, water, and land pollution, as well as its non-renewable resource consumption there. So that's a multi-indicator EPD, which all our 15804 compliant EPDs are. You can also have a single indicator EPD. A lot of those in the international EPD system do have separate climate declarations. A key thing to remember here, though, is you have to have a company has to have a corresponding multi-indicator EPD to be able to have a climate declaration. So a climate declaration really is a subset of that multi-indicator EPD that people have. But just providing a summary about the climate footprint. Now, Rob and Jeff will talk more about the applications of the business case, but this is our take on how people use EPDs and why they are developed, mainly for business-to-business communications, but they could also be used in business-to-consumer communications. They help you substantiate your claims in the marketplace and prevent greenwash and contributions to rating schemes such as green building and sustainable infrastructure. You'll see the point there about ISO 14001, Environmental Management Systems Compliance, where because they're backed by an LCA, a life cycle assessment, companies have the real data that they can use to make improvements in their environmental management of their production systems. An EPD is just a summary of the LCA. So the true value of the EPD is in the LCA background report and the improvements people can make in their design and manufacturing systems. Okay, my last slide, I think. Yeah, so an EP, what it isn't, it's not a type 1 eco label. Now, eco labels, they make a value statement about the product, and an EPD never certifies that a declared product is environmentally superior to alternatives. It just states the data and the facts. Okay, so that judgment or comparison is left to the EPD user in the context of their particular project or the use of their product. Now, within their product categories, rules that an EPDs are developed to ensure that the impacts can be compared on a fair and equitable basis. Rob will have a bit more to say about that. But the important point here is within their product category. So again, I keep going back to EN 15804, which our EPDs, construction product EPDs comply to. That means that they can be compared those different environmental impacts. Okay, my apologies for getting cut off there, but thanks for Rob filling in. I'll just pass over to Rob now for his section. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Steve. Yes, my name is Rouwette. I'm director of Start2See, lifecycle consultant, as I mentioned. So I'll be talking about the details of, well, what do you actually encounter when you try to look at an EPD and try to understand it. So every EPD will have program information, and that states who the program operator is, for example, the Australasian EPD Programme. Now, the reason why that's important is because EPDs from different programs may not be comparable. So if you, and a lot of people are interested in comparing products on the basis of their EPDs. So one of the first things to do is to make sure that ideally they have the same program operator. If not, you've got to be a bit more careful. You also can see who the declaration owner is and who the LCA consultant and verifier were. Now that provides transparency about who's making the claim, who was involved in the LCA, and you can also contact those people with questions about the product or about the EPD. Ideally, all of the relevant information is stated in the EPD, but you might actually want to follow up about the product and how it's being used. The other important thing to look out for are the product category rules and the standards that have been used. Steve already mentioned there's different standards such as ISO 14025, which all EPDs comply with, and EPDs for construction products comply with EN 15804 under the Australasian EPD Programme and a number of other international programs. Now, that is very important, again, if you're comparing, excuse me, if you're comparing EPDs, because only when they're based on the same standards are you able to compare. And even then, if they're based on ISO 14025, that might not always be the case. So the whole reason why EN 15804 was developed is because it actually allows that comparison at a product level and at a building level. More about that later. The other thing that is probably of interest to you is the actual product system description. So when you look at the scope of what is being covered by the EPD, you want to make sure that you understand which product is actually being reported on and ideally how it is being used. Because there are a lot of products that can be quite similar in appearance, but can have quite different environmental impacts. It pays to actually understand what product you're looking at. The EPDs also need to have a product composition, which is also, again, important to understand, well, is this product what I'm actually looking for, or is it something different? And if so, it also helps you understand, well, what are the key ingredients for that material and what are the potential environmental impacts associated with that? EPDs can cover different life cycle stages. They're all based on life cycle assessment, but they don't necessarily cover the full life cycle. So as a mandatory minimum, they need to cover cradle to gate. And For EN 15804 compliant EPDs for construction products, we use these codes A1 to A3, and I'll show you that in a second, how they come together. But that stands for cradle to gate. Now, we also have cradle to gate with options. That's A1 to A3 and a number of options. That's basically up to the company that develops the EPD to decide which ones are relevant. And then there's a cradle to grave EPD, which covers all the life cycle stages from A1 to A3, A4, A5, etc., all the way up to module D. Now, how do these codes come to life? When you consider the life cycle stages of a product, and especially of a construction product, then we can actually define them up front, what they are, because they are the same for each and every construction product. And so we've got your product stage, which includes your raw material supply, transport raw materials to manufacturing, and the actual manufacturing process itself. So those are the stages A1 to A3. Once the product is manufactured, it goes into the construction process stage, which means it's transported to a building site. It goes into the application over there, which is the assembly of the product into its final application. And then it can enter the use stage, where over a number of years, maybe 50 years, maybe longer, shorter, the product is being used. You might have to maintain it. You might have to undertake repairs. There might even be a reason to replace it or to refurbish it. All those things can be taken into account. And if the product itself consumes energy or water, then that can also be reported in modules B6 and B7 in this case. Once the product has fulfilled its services and gets to the end of its useful life, we enter the end of life stage, which in the case of construction products means deconstruction or demolition, transport of the waste materials to a waste processing facility, and ultimately disposal. Now, disposal can also mean recycling or reuse. It can mean landfill, and it can mean incineration. Those are the kind of typical processes that you might come across. Now, for EN 15804, something quite interesting has been developed, because there's been this age-old discussion about when materials and products are being recycled at the end of life, how do we account for that? And without going into too much detail, it can become pretty messy, pretty complicated, and you can have long discussions about where the benefits need to be applied. Who gets the benefit? Is it the company that creates the material for recycling, or is it the company that takes that material and turns it into a new product? What this standard shows us is that actually they cut it off after C4, but they show you the potential benefits and impacts beyond the system boundaries, as they call it. So it gives you an indication of how much value the material still has from an environmental point of view. At the very bottom of this table, and the arrows sort of point in that direction, you can see, and this table is included in every EPD, you can see which modules have been included. They're here indicated by an X, and which are not included, here indicated with MND, module not declared. So that's something to look out for if you are after information about specific life cycle stages. Then you can quickly see whether that's included in the EPD or not. I'm just quickly checking questions. No, that's all good. I'll come back to that later on. So one of the other aspects of an EPD that's very important to consider is the actual unit. Now, each EPD clearly states either a declared unit or a functional unit. Now, these terms are quite important, and they have a huge impact on the actual environmental performance that's being reported. Now, to give you an example of a declared unit, in this case, that looks like 1 ton of reinforced concrete pipework with a given capacity. And the capacity is the class, which is the strength of the pipe, dimensions, length of pipes, etc. They can all be specified. Now, a declared unit relates to the material because 1 ton of pipe is not something that you normally order. You would order a specific size of pipe, a specific class, and a specific length. Now, you can have different types of pipes, of concrete pipes, and they can all be grouped into an average and expressed by 1 ton of concrete pipe. As long as the environmental impacts are quite similar per ton, then you can cover a large range of different products. The benefit of that is that it can be easily extrapolated to the required quantity. So if you know that you need 100 meters of pipe with 900 mil diameter and class 3, then you only need a conversion factor to work out how much material is required, how many tons. Now, a functional unit is something that looks at the whole of life and looks at the actual application of the product. So in this case, that could look like 1 equivalent meter of reinforced concrete pipework with a given capacity, and then applied in a normal environment in Australia with a service life of 100 years. So the application is at the end there. It shows you need to look at where is it being applied, because that will impact on the durability. It could impact on the maintenance requirements. And you also need to know the service lives. In this case, 100 years, because again, if you choose an alternative product that only has a service life of, say, 50 years, then you know that you need to replace it in order to get to this functional unit of 100 years. Now, it's also very important to understand that functional units might not necessarily be representative of other applications. So you can't just compare products across different functional units. So why is that important? Well, if you're comparing EPDs, you need to understand this, and you need to understand what a declared or functional unit is which one is being used, and how to apply them. So when you compare results, you always need to consider the functionality of the product or the functional unit and the application. And so durability is an important aspect of that. So if you compare 1 ton of steel with 1 ton of timber, for example, it's nonsensical. It doesn't give you any useful result, because mass of those materials is not an indicator of functional performance. And so we'll give you an example of a structural beam hereafter. But it's also important to understand that the judgment or comparison is left to the EPD user in the context of their project or use of the product. So what it means is that it's still useful to communicate the environmental impacts of 1 ton of steel in a steel EPD and 1 ton of timber in a timber EPD. And then the user can actually use that information to work out what sort of application am I looking at and how should I compare that. And a declared unit can only be used as direct comparisons under very specific circumstances, basically when the rest of the life cycle is identical. And you really should ask an LCA specialist to assist you with that if you're making these kind of comparisons, because it's really easy to make a mistake and get the wrong conclusion. So how would that look if you look at a fictional example of a structural beam? And so the functional unit in this case could be like a horizontal beam. I need a 4-meter span with a minimum load carrying capacity of a number of tons. And that obviously needs to be specified for a period of 50 years. Now, a steel H-beam can fulfill these functions, and it might require, say, 440 kilograms of structural steel, and you then add transport from a local steel mill to your project site, etc. And if you needed a timber beam, or if you wanted a timber beam to do that, you might require, say, 100 kilogram softwood timber glulam beam, which might come from Europe and might have larger dimensions and require some steel fixings to do the same thing. But because you also need to consider the functionality, you need to consider any differences in assembly. Can you do that mechanically or manually? Are there any differences in maintenance and disposal scenarios, etc., etc.? So you really want to look at the whole life cycle in order to make a proper comparison. It also pays to think about other functions that might be relevant. So we've talked about load carrying capacity, but other things that might be relevant are fire safety standards, dimensions, aesthetics, etc., etc. So really, if you want to compare two materials or two products, make sure you're comparing them on a like-for-like basis. I'll quickly show you the results of the assessment, how that looks. So you'll see tables like these in every EPD. And they state the life cycle stages that are being presented, the type of product and the declared unit here at the top, the environmental indicators, the indicator results. Those are all the numbers that you can see. And then we also report a number of parameters and the parameter results for EN 15804 compliant EPDs. Now, these numbers can be used in tools if they're set up to do so. And so some of you might be familiar with the ISCA materials calculator. ISCA is the Infrastructure Sustainability Council of Australia. And they have a calculator that allows people to look and improve the design of infrastructure projects on their environmental performance. And so, for example, if we take this EPD for concrete pipes, we can enter that information directly into the calculator and it will give you the results. So basically, you can select your product and your quantity. You can add transport as is relevant to your project, and it shows you the environmental performance of that product. Now, one of the reasons why that's quite useful in the building and construction sector is that a building obviously contains a lot of different materials, and so EPDs are perfect for passing on information through the supply chain, and it allows others to make more sustainable design and purchasing decisions. Now, this is an example only, but you could use EPDs for timber, steel, insulation material, etc. Excuse me, to combine them into building design. And in this case, we actually have an EPD of a whole building, which uses a number of, not other EPDs, but it uses a number of really interesting products that go into that building. EPDs can be broader than just the LCA data, so you've got an opportunity to highlight other company and product related environmental information, such as quality and durability, or instructions for users, and examples of environmental management systems that you've got in place, and supply chain management, social responsibility initiatives, etc., etc. I'll hand over to Jeff now, who will be giving you some further insights into how and why EPDs are being used.
Thanks very much, Rob. So my name's Jeff Vickers, and I'm Technical Director of ThinkStep in Australasia. As Rob mentioned, we produce a lot of environmental product declarations. And what I wanted to do today is to share the 9 key reasons why the companies that we work with produce and use environmental product declarations. So if we could just move on to the 2 slides forward, Rob, that'd be great. The first reason that they do this is typically around creating a competitive edge. So EPDs are still relatively new within the Australian and New Zealand market. And as Steve mentioned earlier, there's only about 50 published so far under the Australasian EPD Programme. So as such, companies that do produce them get a leg up during tendering for large projects. So I'm just presenting an example on the left here of that came through one of our lighting companies that we work with. This is a request they received from Lend-Lease a number of years ago, and it talked about requests for life cycle information and environmental product declarations. For those of you who know Lend-Lease, you know this is a little bit of an old example because they've changed their logo since then, but just to give you the idea that companies are starting to push through their supply chains to try and request this sort of information. And even in the cases where they're not, a lot of our customers are using EPDs proactively in tendering. So when there's no formal request, they're putting the EPD into the tender anyway and using it as a commitment to transparency and providing the best sort of science-based quantitative data. The second reason for producing an EPD is to become a preferred supplier. So this is linked to the previous one. So for building and infrastructure companies in particular, environmental product declarations earn them points within green building rating tools. So the most obvious ones in Australia are Green Star of the Green Building Council of Australia and the ISCA Infrastructure Sustainability Rating Tool, but also in the Australian market you see BREEAM used from the UK, you see LEED used from the US Green Building Council, and all of these different systems award some form of credits for having an EPD. You can also see on the left hand side there that the top reason that companies are producing or going down the green building path in Australia is really client demand. This is from the recent Smart Market report released 2 weeks ago on World Green Building Trends. And you can see that, you know, if that's what's driving green building, that's really what's going to be driving environmental product declarations too. So the third reason for producing an EPD is really marketing. And if you look at EPDs from all around the world, you'll see that they look quite different. So if you're in Germany, the EPDs are very standardized. You know, the Germans, they love standardization. The EPDs to my eyes, don't look fantastic, but they give you all the data that you need. If you look at EPDs produced in Australia and New Zealand, which some of the examples shown here, they look a bit sexier. You know, we've got a bit more freedom around formatting. You've still got all the detailed numbers in the back, so they're comparable internationally as well in many cases. But you know, the front end is a bit nicer to read and a bit nicer to look at. But as I say, still the detail in the back end. So if you're thinking about, you know, and when you're thinking about what an EPD is, one way of sort of imagining the information that's presented is a comparison to a nutrition label. So if you flick over the back of a product and you see, you know, the grams of fat and the kilojoules of energy and whatever else in it, an EPD is similar to that, but it's giving information on, you know, the carbon footprint, the carbon embodied in the product, or the energy embodied in the product, the water embodied in the product, you know, contribution to acid rain, to nutrient loading in waterways, to summer smog, all these different things. So an EPD is kind of like a nutrition label for a product, but covering the full life cycle or a subset of it. So the fourth reason to produce an EPD is to fast track carbon neutrality. So in order to offset the carbon emissions from your product, you first need to know what those emissions are. So, you know, the EPD, it calculates the carbon footprint, and that enables you to buy the carbon offsets that you need in order to make that product carbon neutral. And so, for example, under the National Carbon Offset Standard in Australia, you know, EPDs produced under the Australasian EPD Programme are explicitly recognised, and you can use the carbon calculation you've already done as part of the EPD in order to calculate the size of the offsets you need to purchase, and then create a carbon neutral product through that sort of system, and then you can sort of badge the product and use that in your marketing as well. The fifth reason for producing an EPD is to support environmental management systems. So I think in 2015, the ISO 14001 environmental management system, so next slide, Rob, was updated, and as part of that, they brought in a requirement for life cycle thinking. So life cycle assessment and environmental product declarations are the more formal part of that. Next slide, Rob, if you can. They're the more formal part of that, but life cycle thinking is the kind of informal you know, concept that sort of that links into life cycle thinking, life cycle assessment, and environmental product declarations. So the sixth reason is supply chain management. And so, for example, you would have heard of things like the Rana Plaza tragedy in Bangladesh, where over 1,000 workers were killed, and dramatically affected the textile supply chain and had huge implications for downstream brands. I saw an article yesterday that the Bangladesh is actually now planning to eject the safety inspectors that were brought in after this disaster, which is quite worrying. But you know, EPDs can also help you to really, and the life cycle assessment process can really help you to understand your full supply chain, your full value chain, and to consider where the risks are in that chain. And so this can help you with, you know, your contributions and reporting on the UN Sustainable Development Goals, on identifying things like conflict minerals in the supply chain if you're an electronics manufacturer, and in identifying things like modern slavery, for example, if you're also considering the social side of life cycle assessment and taking that kind of whole supply chain view. The seventh and kind of interesting reason about for producing an EPD is about product and process innovation. So we work with a manufacturer called David Trowbridge. They produce beautiful pendant lamps, if you've ever seen them, the ones hanging here. In the past, several years ago, they used to ship those pendant lamps fully assembled. So they were a manufacturer of, you know, high-end furniture. They thought that those things should go in a box and come out exactly as presented and go to the customer as they were intended straight out of the factory. They did ship some flat pack product, but not certainly the vast minority of it was flat pack. Through doing life cycle assessment, they realized the environmental impact of doing that. The impact of the freight from their products was horrendous, as you could expect, because they're mostly shipping air. And they made a conscious decision that they were going to move virtually in all of their production across to flat pack. And through doing that, they saved themselves money. They made it much easier for them to export further afield. And they also decided that they were going to make the process of putting together the product part of the product itself, because there's been a lot of studies that show that if you assemble something yourself, you keep it longer. And so they made that kind of part of the experience. And so David Trowbridge, you know, they're a tiny company, about 20 people, but they use life cycle assessment and environmental product declarations as a way of driving innovation and helping to validate the decisions that they're making to ensure that what they're doing meets their values as a company that values sustainability in the sort of the natural world. So the eighth reason to produce an environmental product declaration is really around reducing cost. So life cycle assessment, through its nature, identifies hotspots in your production chain and your supply chain. And so that's an important way of identifying excess waste, excess raw material input that is then being wasted, areas of significant hotspots in terms of energy use, water use, whatever. And that helps you to prioritize where those areas are that you can look to target through improvement initiatives, because it helps you to say, okay, we've got a big complex supply chain, but here are the 5 to 10 key items that really make a difference in terms of material use, water use, energy use, whatever it happens to be. And so those are ones where you can then look at and say, okay, can we influence this? Can we drive it down? The EPD itself also helps to reduce costs by putting all of the environmental information in one place. So a lot of our customers, they say they use an EPD as a single source of the truth. It's a verified document. It's got a lot of information in it. As Rob mentioned before, it also can include qualitative, non-LCA data in it. So it can talk about the eco labels that you have and the great stuff you've done in improving energy efficiency on site, or the suppliers that you've chosen to work with for, such and such a reason because they're reducing their carbon footprint. And through the EPD process, all of that qualitative information gets verified as well. And so you end up with quite a quick, a document that can tell a story as well. It doesn't just have to give the hard numbers. It can also have other information and links to other kind of sources of what you're doing, and talk about all your great work and environmental management systems, etc. So by having both of those together, you can streamline the response to tenders, for example, because you don't then have to pull out 7 different documents and go and talk to Bob and the manufacturing site to find out whatever, and Joe and logistics. You can then just basically say, here's the document that kind of covers all of our sort of environmentally relevant information. And the 9th and final reason is around benchmarking. And I think Rob covered a lot of this in his presentation, but one thing I just wanted to flag is that EPDs are increasingly being recognized as a way to determine that products are quote unquote green. So an EPD doesn't tell you if a product is better than another, but what it does do is give you the information to assess if that product is better than another in the context of whatever you're doing. So in the building and construction space, is product A better than product B in the context of our building? And procuring other products, is laptop X better than laptop Y for our particular application where we're using the laptops in such and such a way, and it enables you to make those kinds of informed decisions in the context of your operation, rather than saying, is laptop A better than laptop B, tick. It's really around how do we use it, and in the context of how we use it, is it better or not? And so I think that context is a lot of what EPDs bring, and they give the numbers. So I always think of them as sort of numbers without judgment. We don't say good or bad, we just say here's the data, and then it's up to the user to assess whether the product is good or bad in their context. But the important part is those numbers have been verified, and they give you a lot of different indicators. So you can then say, I'm just interested in carbon footprint, or I'm just interested in local acidification, or whatever it is, and you can pick and choose the things that matter most to you as an organization and make the assessment in the context of your operation. And that's it from me. Those are the 9 reasons I wanted to present, and I think we can now take questions from the audience. So back over to you, Rob.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, as Jeff mentioned, we have time. We've got about 15-20 minutes for questions, so please feel free to enter them into the question fields. We've already got 2. I'll give you a minute to enter a few more before I come back to them. I just wanted to highlight some quotes from EPD owners, because you've heard from Steve, from Jeff, and myself about how we see EPDs are being used, and there's a lot of opportunities out there. And what do EPD owners say themselves? And so Jane Mansfield from Australasian Care has stated, our EPDs are a key differentiator and enable us to set a benchmark for sustainable tissue manufacturing in Australia and New Zealand in a way that's credible, transparent, and comparable. So Australasian Care, they manufacture tissues and a number of paper products, and so they are looking for credible information. They're looking for transparency, and they want to be able to compare it. And correct me if I'm wrong there, Jeff, but I think they use it for internal benchmarking as well, and to measure improvement over time.
That's correct, yeah, they do.
Paolo from Fraser's Property has said that EPDs provide transparent and clear information to help us identify products that will reduce the environmental impact of our developments across their entire life cycle. So Fraser's Property developers, they build buildings, they build infrastructure, and they obviously when they're procuring products, they're looking for products with a lower environmental impact. And as Jeff said, the EPD itself doesn't prove that a product has a lower environmental impact, but it gives you the information to make that assessment in its particular application. And that is how we see that being used quite a lot in the construction and infrastructure sector. And that's also one of the things that people are doing through the ISCA materials calculator. They're looking at different materials, different products to make those kind of purchasing decisions. When we look at external users, EPDs give stakeholders the confidence that we are telling the truth about the impact of our manufacturing processes. That's a statement by Mark Heekert from the Plastics Industry Pipe Association of Australia. So they're looking at communicating with stakeholders. Again, as Jeff mentioned, looking at a document that provides reliable information, a single source of the truth, if you like, about the life cycle impacts of their products. And finally, another quote from Jane, in a crowded market, we need to be able to differentiate our products and brands from our competitors and clearly articulate why we are the best choice for our customers and consumers. So really coming back to not just the life cycle, but also explaining what the life cycle benefits are of your product. And you can add that additional information about all the other things that you're doing, about you can inform your clients how to best use your product or how to best dispose of your product when they're done using it. Okay, we'll come back to the questions. So I'll just read them out and I'll pass them on if somebody else needs to answer them. First one is actually addressed to me. Rob, I'm reflecting the life cycle stages table. How does this account or address the circular economy concepts? Great question, Craig. So some of you might be familiar with the circular economy principle, which looks at materials from a holistic point of view and tries to design products and materials in a way that there will be no waste, that there is a way to use them at the end of life, and so there's no more disposal to landfill. And LCA aligns very well with that. We use slightly different metrics, but they can be applied to one another. And so the EPD can show you that what happens at the end of life, and usually the EPD shows you what currently happens at the end of life. So if we don't have a fully operating circular principle, then that's reflected in the EPD. But you can also show, well, what would happen if we were able to recycle this product fully. So you can actually show what the benefits are of doing so. And you can, again, add that kind of information in the additional environmental performance impacts to make that clear to the readers. The second question is, what were the diagonal arrows at the bottom of the chart? And I'll just quickly go back to that. Sorry, I think it's this one. So the two arrows reflect whether a module is included or not. And MND stands for module not declared, or the X stands for basically it is included. Now, I think that was the one. Let me know if you were talking about this one, but I think this one speaks for itself. EPDs for cross-laminated timbers not available in Australia. How about in New Zealand? I'll pass it on to Jeff and Steve.
Watch the space.
Yeah, there are EPDs for cross-laminated timber that's produced in Europe. Yes, but as Jeff advises, watch this space.
Yeah, sorry, we can't give details of things that aren't published yet, but you know, there's definitely work being done on those kinds of products around the world, and certainly, you know, CLT is manufactured in New Zealand. So yeah, all I can say at the time is watch the space.
Yeah, you can go to the website of Australasian EPD, which is epd-australasia.com. You'll see all the EPDs there. We've registered one for Australian produced glue laminated softwood and hardwood. which is a very similar process to CLT.
Yeah, that's right, Steve. There's very little difference actually. Just the dimension of the finished product is the main difference.
Thanks for that. Next question from Andrew. Perhaps a bit of a cheeky one. What is the typical price range to create an EPD in Australia? I think without sort of going into too much detail, because it's obviously commercially sensitive to some extent, but I think it's fair to say that an EPD roughly starts at in the order of $20,000 for a typical product. It can be a bit cheaper if it's a very simple, straightforward product, and it goes up to a multitude of that if you've got a range of products in a complex life cycle. There's a number of parameters that determine the price, but does that?
Could I just add to that, Rob? Not talking about price specifically, but some companies with complex products and manufacturing process, this is a really substantial investment for them. So, I mean, I applaud the companies that sort of go for these EPDs because, you know, they're really committed to environmental transparency and some substantial investments in producing this information and getting it verified. So, just a bit of a side note there.
Yeah, and it's typically it's done in, because it's always based on an LCA, so you get a lot more information out of it than just the EPD, and so it kind of aligns with the cost for doing an ISO 14040 compliant LCA that sort of sits in that same same kind of cost, but you do get a lot more out of it, and you can use the LCA, you can use it for internal purposes, you can use it for external purposes through the EPD. So it's really about making sure that you get enough value out of it. So if you're just doing it to get the EPD, then you're probably missing out on some additional value that the LCA and the EPD can generate for you. And yeah, definitely recommend talking to an LCA consultant in order to get that scope right up front. Could EPDs be used for smart electronic products as well? And do we have examples? I'll just quickly say that in Australia and New Zealand there are no examples of that at the moment. The primary driver is in the building and construction sector. So you'll see that 90% or so of the EPDs registered here are for building and construction products. Internationally, there are, from memory, a few electronic products. Smart products, I'm not sure if they have been done, but I think they... Rob,
could I take that one, just because of my background is life cycle assessment of electronics, and maybe I can elaborate a little bit?
Yeah, sure, Jeff. Sorry.
No, that's all good. So that's a fair assessment. I just want to add a few things. So in the Australasian market, there's an EPD for zip water, so their hydrotap product, that you wouldn't expect to be electronics, but there's actually quite a lot of electrical and electronics going on under the bench. So they've got a module there that's got a lot of electronics in it, and so we did do some life cycle assessment of electronics for that product, but you wouldn't think of it as an electronic product per se. There isn't too many EPDs, as Rob says, of electronics in the market, but there's a lot of life cycle assessment done. So if you look at Apple's website, or Microsoft's website, or whoever, they produce like product environmental reports, and that's all based on life cycle assessment. So the reason why you don't typically see EPDs is because the manufacturers don't agree enough to create a product category rules, which is the thing you need to produce the EPD. So there were some that were done in South Korea, but they weren't ever taken up. And the sort of larger manufacturers of electronics tend to go their own way. But we do a lot of life cycle assessment work of consumer electronics, industrial electronics around the world. It's just they don't tend to get to that EPD stage because the industry doesn't tend to agree on the rules that they'd produce and the use cases that they would specify and that kind of thing. But there's product category rules for, let's say, power electronics being released a few years ago by UL in the US. So you can now do motor starters and that sort of stuff. So there's variable speed drives. So that kind of thing is coming through.
Thanks, Jeff.
Could I just add to that, Jeff, about the product category rules you mentioned? The product categories rules for construction products are that EN 15804 we mentioned. That's the basic product category rules. That's why a lot of rules are already agreed about for construction price, which is one of the reasons there's so many EPDs for them. But as Jeff mentioned, there's lots of product category rules coming out. There's one for natural fibres being produced today. It's just been released by the International EPD Programme. There's some for tyres, for machinery, for chemicals. So these library of rules is sort of building up all the time, which means that more EPDs for more products can be produced, and then hence be comparable in the marketplace.
Thanks.
Thank you.
The next question is, do you think EPDs will become a requirement for government procurement, for example, for roads or infrastructure? And if so, how far away might that be? I'll briefly say that in Australia, that's currently not on the horizon as far as I can tell. It's purely on a voluntary basis. Steve, Jeff, do you want to add anything to that from your perspective?
Yeah, I think that's true, but you do see it for specific projects. So if for a project they decide that they want to, so we have customers who have come to us because they've had a requirement from a government agency to produce an environmental product declaration. So there are some Australian sort of agencies and cities that are making it a requirement on a kind of case-by-case basis. And so you see it, for example, in the transport sector, for example, when new road building or rail projects or that kind of thing, where EPDs start to be required because they're going for a certain ISCA rating, for example, or they've decided that they're going to do it as an example. So I could see that it would come, but probably it typically would come at that bigger project level. EPDs at the moment, they get a lot of uptake mainly for things like, building big precincts or large scale projects. They're mainly used at that bigger end of the market at the moment. And so I think on a project by project level, yes. At a national level, harder to say.
It's a good distinction.
Steve, do you want to?
Yeah, that's a fair summary, Jeff. I think, well, I can definitely see them. I mean, having used to work for state government in the waste and recycling area, as well as some procurement, sustainable procurement area, they're quite attractive to introduce these requirements from a government perspective, because they are based on life cycle assessment and science-based methodology. So, and they don't make value statements about particular products as well. So an EPD requirement. So it's just a requirement to gather the information to help government decision making. So to put those in procurement requirements, I think, is very attractive from a government perspective. And you actually found an example of that in California in the US recently, where they're putting some requirements on steel procurement and other infrastructure projects in actual Californian state procurement requirements. So I think, and in Germany you've got some similar requirements. So I definitely think that's the way it will be headed, and because it's quite attractive for government to put this sort of requirements in.
Yeah, and maybe just to add one more thing. So there's definitely requirements around the world for all government buildings over a certain spend to be green building rated. So that example that Steve just gave in Germany, there's also similar cases in France and other parts of Europe where, buildings over, say, €2 million have to be, accredited to whatever green building rating system they choose. And so as part of that, there's typically points for EPDs. So that creates a kind of semi-informal requirement for EPDs. You don't necessarily have to have an EPD per se, but if you don't, then you've got to get the points elsewhere. So I'd say it's relatively likely to enforce green building rating, and you're even seeing that in New Zealand now coming through in the home building sector. But then it's just a case of whether the specific developers decide to go for the EPD points or go for other points.
I can add to that, if we're talking about international examples in Europe, what we've also seen is that in the Netherlands, for example, they've got a national database with materials impacts that's being used for large construction projects, everything that the government is involved in above a certain size. And in order to get your products into that database, you basically need to have an EPD. So it is then indirectly required to do that if you want to have the benefits of being implemented in the database.
And that's almost similar for ISCA, isn't it, Rob, in terms of getting into the materials calculator? It's, EPD data is the key way a manufacturer can get their product-specific data in. Correct me if I'm wrong, but...
Yeah, for manufacturers, for manufacturer-specific information, that's definitely the way to go. There is another pathway through AusLCI, the Australian Lifecycle Inventory Database, but that's only available for branch organizations, for the representatives of the manufacturers at an industry level. At a product level, EPDs are the way to go, definitely. I'm just going to move on because we've got a few minutes left. Kate's question about cost has been answered. Next question is, what exactly is a PCR and how can it be linked to an EPD? So PCR is the product category rules. It's kind of like a standard. It's based on the ISO standards or the European EN standard 15804, and it just is a little bit more specific about which rules and guidelines to follow for that particular product category. So it makes sure that the different LCAs that are being done are tighter and therefore more comparable.
Just want to mention the asphalt PCR that's out there for comment at the moment, Rob.
Yeah, if anyone's interested in roads and in asphalt materials, we currently have got a regional appendix to the product category rules for asphalt mixtures out there, and you can find that on the website of the Australasian EPD Programme, which is on the screen. And you're able to comment on that until the 4th of December. It's already been open for consultation for 3 weeks. So, and that shows you some of the calculation rules that we're going to apply for asphalt products in Australia and New Zealand. What version of the IS calculator allows users to input the EPD data? So I'm just continuing. We've got 2 minutes left. Version 1.2 doesn't appear to have that functionality, which is correct. We've made a significant update to the materials calculator in version 2.0 in order to be able to take the information from an EPD directly into the calculator. That required the methodology, the underlying methodology, to be updated. So EPDs cannot go into version 1.2 because the methodology is different and it's a one-way street. You can't back calculate it. The last one, can EPDs be used for food and beverage products? Or are there other types of LCAs which are more suitable? Jeff, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, there already are product category rules for food and beverage products, and there are EPDs for them as well under the international EPD system. So I think there's some of chocolate, for example. There's been EPDs of wine in the past. So definitely it can be used in that space, and I'd say that's probably a growing area. You know, probably the best example we have in Australasia at the moment is the ones done by Australia Care in the sort of, you know, toilet paper tissue type category, not food and beverage, but getting into the sort of fast moving consumer goods category. And so there's definitely the rules in place to do that. It's just whether, you know, there's demand to actually produce them, but it definitely can be done and is done in Europe.
Yeah, the international EPD system has published quite a few of these, for example, for a number of pasta products.
Oh yeah, there's all the pasta EPDs. You're right, Rob. Yeah.
Okay. Wary of the time. It's 2 p.m. Really great to see some fantastic questions and to see everyone being engaged. So thank you again for your attendance, and we hope that you got something out of this webinar. Feel free to contact any of the presenters with any follow-up questions you might have, and keep an eye out for the recording and the slides. And we look forward to seeing you. Just also quickly mentioning that the LCA conference in Australia is being organized in March. So if you're interested in that, go to the ALCAS, the Australian LCA Society's website. It will be organized from the 4th till the 6th of March in Cronulla in Sydney. And so look forward to seeing you there. Thanks, everyone.